The gavel detonated, and the room flinched as water shivered in pitchers and papers leapt. Judge Clarence Doyle said, "Order." Coffee cup toppled and bled across the tile. Evelyn Hart stared at the spill, as if it were her future spreading thin. Miles Redding said, "Proceed, Mr. Voss." Caleb Voss said, "I took the contract." Air vanished, and the gallery gasped like one body. Lena Cross said, "Name who hired you." Caleb Voss said, "I will, under oath." The reporter's pen froze, then carved again. A juror's knuckles blanched and would not loosen. Evelyn felt the bench dig into her spine like a verdict already written. Judge Doyle said, "Say the truth and only the truth." Caleb Voss said, "The target lived because I missed." The word "missed" ricocheted through hearts. Evelyn said, "Why me?" No one answered. Silence pooled as if the building forgot to breathe, and Evelyn counted the beats like steps toward a cliff. Miles Redding said, "Tell us who ordered it." Caleb Voss stared at the oath card as though it could burn his tongue clean. Judge Doyle said, "Answer." Lena Cross said, "You are under protection for truthfulness." A flicker of relief tried and failed to live in Evelyn. Caleb Voss said, "The order came through a cutout." The word "cutout" felt like a trapdoor under her shoes. Darren Cole said, "Anonymous broker. Write that before catching the glare of the bailiff." Ruth Miller rubbed her temple, hunting a memory she could not place. Evelyn said, "He is lying about the miss." The claim tasted like rust in her mouth. Miles Redding said, "We will see." Evelyn felt the case tilt like a ship in sudden swell, and she gripped the table to stay aboard. Judge Doyle said, "Mr. Voss, specify the broker." Caleb Voss said, "They used a ghost number and dropped cash." Miles Redding said, "You kept records." Caleb Voss said, "In my head." Lena Cross said, "Convenient." The gallery hissed and then swallowed the sound. Ruth Miller watched Evelyn instead of the witness, and wondered why fear sat so neatly on her face. Darren Cole said, "This is personal," into the recorder. Evelyn said, "I never met him." The denial felt fragile as spun glass. Miles Redding said, "But someone did." Thunder folded itself into the rafters. The bailiff's boots ticked once on tile, and the sound drew every gaze like a magnet. Officer Tom Briggs said, "Maintain decorum." Miles Redding said, "Mr. Voss, why now?" Caleb Voss said, "Because I see what they want to bury." Evelyn's pulse drummed an answer she could not say aloud. Lena Cross said, "Name the broker, or the court moves to strike." Judge Doyle said, "The witness will comply." Ruth Miller's breath caught, snagging on a thought that would not surface. Darren Cole said, "He is stalling," and the keys of his laptop clattered too loud in the hush. Evelyn said, "He is measuring how much to burn." The rain sharpened and beat the glass like slow applause. Judge Doyle adjusted his glasses and let the weight of the moment find its balance. Judge Doyle said, "You swore to tell it all." Caleb Voss said, "I was hired to make a death look like an accident." Evelyn tasted panic and salt and forced it back. Miles Redding said, "Who benefits?" Caleb Voss said, "A legacy would flip." Darren Cole said, "Inheritance angle," into his mic. Lena Cross said, "This is bait unless he ties it to a name." Ruth Miller pressed her palm to the rail, steadying a tremor she did not admit. Evelyn said, "I will not drown in this." The room waited as the rain wrote lines no one could read. Evelyn's chest felt hollow, as if breath was rationed. Each inhale a struggle she could not afford to lose. Lena Cross said, "Stay steady, they want you rattled." Evelyn nodded, though her jaw trembled. Judge Doyle said, "The jury will disregard unverified claims." Miles Redding smirked, sliding a fresh folder across his table. Caleb Voss stared at his lap as if buried there was salvation or damnation. Darren Cole whispered into his recorder, "The tension is bleeding the room dry." Ruth Miller wiped her palms against her skirt, the sound of fabric brushing like sandpaper. Evelyn said, "I did not invite this trial, it swallowed me whole." The storm outside cracked a shard of light into the chamber. The echo of thunder seemed to shake Evelyn's thoughts loose. She remembered a stadium roar years ago when she was celebrated, not accused. Evelyn whispered, "They once cheered my name." Lena Cross said, "That is why they want it silenced now." Miles Redding said, "The witness has confirmed a contract killing," each syllable laced with triumph. Judge Doyle said, "He has confirmed intent, not completion." Ruth Miller leaned forward, eyes narrowed at Evelyn, searching her face like scripture. Darren Cole typed furiously, fingers aching from repetition. Evelyn said, "If truth is buried, then I will dig with my hands." The gallery buzzed like a hive strung too tight. Evelyn felt the courtroom shrink into a stage she never auditioned for, every eye dragging across her like a spotlight. Darren Cole said, "This is performance as much as justice." Judge Doyle said, "Control the gallery," as whispers grew louder. Caleb Voss said, "I never missed, not before her." Miles Redding said, "And that failure is why you sit here." Ruth Miller glanced at the bailiff as if asking for safety she could not voice. Lena Cross said, "Failure cuts both ways." Evelyn said, "You brand me guilty because you fear what else might be true." The silence was thick again, each second a hammer. Rain clattered on glass, syncopated with the scrape of pens. Judge Doyle rubbed his temple, holding the room together with weary hands. Judge Doyle said, "Proceed with facts or I will strike testimony." Miles Redding said, "Then let us address the money trail." Darren Cole muttered, "Always the money." Evelyn clutched the table, nails pressing grooves into oak. Lena Cross said, "Show your evidence or stop wasting the court's time." Caleb Voss raised his chin, defiant for the first time. Caleb Voss said, "The account was fed by hands she never touched." Ruth Miller blinked at Evelyn, torn between pity and suspicion. Evelyn said, "My life reduced to numbers that are not mine." The hum of fluorescent lights blended with rain's hiss, a chorus of fatigue and pressure. Darren Cole's recorder clicked, capturing fragments of unraveling truth. Evelyn whispered, "I am cornered, but not broken." Lena Cross said, "We fight with silence and timing." Miles Redding said, "The jury deserves clarity," his words a blade polished for show. Caleb Voss said, "I was given a name, not hers, not then." Judge Doyle leaned forward, eyes piercing over frames. Ruth Miller tightened her arms, holding a secret that swam in her blood. Evelyn felt her pulse climb but steadied it. She said, "Then let the truth breathe before you strangle it." The storm's rage outside was no match for the turbulence inside, where each voice cracked like thunder. Miles Redding said, "The money trail is clear." Lena Cross said, circumstantial and thin as smoke. Judge Doyle rapped his gavel, but the sound felt drowned by whispers rushing like wind. Darren Cole muttered, "The jury is bleeding doubt." Ruth Miller pressed her nails into her palm, pain anchoring her from a truth she feared. Caleb Voss said, "I was told to silence her legacy." Evelyn's heart pounded loud enough to replace the rain. Evelyn said, "They fear the legacy because it breathes louder than their lies." The gallery stirred, some with nods, others with narrowed eyes. Judge Doyle said, "The court will hear evidence, not theatrics." Evelyn whispered, "Then evidence must burn brighter than fear." The jury box seemed to tilt as secrets clawed for daylight. Miles Redding said, "A hidden inheritance connects directly to her name." Lena Cross said, "That is speculation dressed as law." Judge Doyle adjusted his glasses, weary but resolute. Evelyn fought the tremor in her hands, gripping the table as if it could anchor her past. Caleb Voss looked up, eyes hollow with reluctant truth. Caleb Voss said, "They paid me through a fund older than her career." Darren Cole scribbled fast, muttering, "This is blood money traced to shadows." Ruth Miller's breath shivered, her gaze locked on Evelyn. Evelyn said, "You chain me to ghosts because you fear the living truth." The storm outside cracked lightning that shook glass and hearts alike. Evelyn's memory surfaced uninvited, flashes of applause and medals twisted into this nightmare trial. Evelyn said, once they crowned me, now they crown me guilty. Miles Redding said, fame does not shield from law. Lena Cross said, nor should ambition condemn. Judge Doyle sighed as if he bore the weight of history on his shoulders. Caleb Voss's lips trembled, a man unraveling under oath. Caleb Voss said, the order was faceless, but the whispers carried her name. Darren Cole tapped his recorder twice, whispering, names cut sharper than blades. Ruth Miller shut her eyes, a flicker of recognition shadowing her features. Evelyn said, you fear my truth more than my lie. Silence pressed down like iron chains, heavier than thunder. The storm thudded like a drumbeat as Miles Redding threw another folder onto the table, papers spilling like evidence and daggers. Miles Redding said, bank records do not lie. Lena Cross said, but their interpretation does. Judge Doyle leaned forward, warning eyes cutting through chaos. Evelyn pressed her palms to her knees, steadying breath against rising panic. Caleb Voss stared at the folder as if it held his own grave. Darren Cole whispered, the case is cracking at the edges. Ruth Miller shook her head, denying thoughts she could not bury. Evelyn said, I am not defined by their paper chains. Miles Redding said, the jury will decide. Thunder growled in answer, as if the sky judged too. The courtroom felt like a cage, every breath a rattle of bars closing tighter. Evelyn whispered, they will not crush me. Lena Cross said, truth will cut sharper than their lies. Miles Redding said, we expose her through evidence, not mercy. Judge Doyle tapped his gavel, tone firm yet weary. Caleb Voss said, I was promised protection, not ruin. Darren Cole recorded, voice low, a promise is now a noose. Ruth Miller clasped her hands together, hiding tremors that threatened exposure. Evelyn lifted her chin, eyes daring the room. Evelyn said, if they bury me, I will rise through their cracks. The gallery froze, the storm outside applauding with relentless thunder. The courtroom air snapped when Caleb Voss's voice rose, breaking through the thunder of doubt. Caleb Voss said, the name you seek belongs not to her, but to blood in her shadow. Evelyn froze, her spine straight as a blade. Miles Redding said, state the name now. Ruth Miller's nails clawed at the rail, heart racing. Lena Cross said, if you speak, speak it whole. Judge Doyle leaned forward, eyes burning through fog. Darren Cole whispered, the ground just cracked. Caleb Voss said, the one who hired me is her kin. Gasps tore through the gallery like gunfire. Evelyn whispered, family. The word hollowed her chest as silence swallowed the room. Gasps rippled into murmurs, the gallery's disbelief feeding the storm outside. Miles Redding said, name them for the record. Caleb Voss said, it was arranged by one who shares her blood. Evelyn's throat locked, breath snagging. Lena Cross said, you will give us clarity or none at all. Ruth Miller pressed trembling lips shut, her eyes damp with unspoken knowledge. Judge Doyle slammed the gavel, voice sharp as steel. Judge Doyle said, the court will have order. Darren Cole whispered into his recorder, this is betrayal wrapped in family skin. Evelyn whispered, why them, not me? The silence carried weight heavier than any verdict yet spoken. The storm outside crashed, but inside the real lightning had struck. Caleb Voss said, the broker's contact is her relative, closer than any stranger could cut. Miles Redding's jaw tightened, as if triumph slipped from his hands. Lena Cross said, if this court allows, we will demand testimony from the accused kin. Ruth Miller squeezed her temple, a memory surfacing with dread. Judge Doyle said, the claim will be verified. Darren Cole scribbled frantically, whispering, headlines rewrite themselves in bloodlines. Evelyn whispered, my blood betrays me. Her voice broke like glass under weight. The silence that followed became its own verdict, binding everyone in shock. The gallery buzzed like a hive torn open, whispers rising until Judge Doyle struck the bench. Judge Doyle, said silence, or I clear the room." Evelyn felt the weight of betrayal carve into her bones. Lena Cross said, "We must test this accusation with sworn proof." Miles Redding said, "The claim is enough to seed guilt." Darren Cole whispered, "Truth is now poison." Ruth Miller's eyes darted to Evelyn, a silent plea clashing with guilt. Caleb Voss said, "I did not lie under oath." Evelyn whispered, "Blood should bind, not break." The storm pounded the windows like fists, each beat echoing the fracture of trust. The storm's roar fused with hearts hammering in the chamber. Evelyn whispered, "If truth betrays me, what shields remain?" Lena Cross said, "We strike at the root of his words." Miles Redding said, "The jury has heard enough to weigh betrayal." Judge Doyle said, "This court demands tangible proof before blame is bound." Caleb Voss lowered his head, voice cracking, "I cannot take the name back." Darren Cole muttered, "History pivots on whispers and scars." Ruth Miller shut her eyes tight, as if holding back a truth too sharp to free. Evelyn lifted her chin, steel under fracture, and said, "Then let the truth cut through, even if it cuts me." The room swelled with silence before Miles Redding rose, voice sharp as a blade. Miles Redding said, "The truth has spilled, now the jury must see its weight." Evelyn's breath caught, her eyes burning with defiance. Lena Cross said, "Confession without proof is smoke, not fire." Judge Doyle's gavel cracked once, demanding focus. Darren Cole whispered into his recorder, "Every heart is leaning forward, waiting for the knife to drop." Caleb Voss lowered his eyes, sweat trickling down his brow. Ruth Miller's chest heaved, her secret pressing like a stone on her ribs. Evelyn said, "I will not collapse beneath the sins of others." The storm outside rumbled like judgment itself. The storm's rhythm beat against glass as if echoing the pounding of Evelyn's chest. Judge Doyle said, "Proceed with your closing arguments." Miles Redding stepped forward, his voice booming with confidence. Miles Redding said, "This woman stands at the center of blood and betrayal." Evelyn's face stiffened, jaw locked. Lena Cross said, "And yet not one shred of evidence ties her hand." Caleb Voss whispered, "Her blood called me, not her voice." Ruth Miller pressed her palms together as if in prayer. Darren Cole murmured, "This is no trial. This is a crucifixion." Evelyn whispered, "If they bury me, they bury the truth with me." The gallery buzzed, restless as thunder growled over the courthouse. Miles Redding's hands slashed the air with authority. Miles Redding said, "You cannot hide behind silence." Lena Cross rose slowly, voice steady as steel. Lena Cross said, "Silence speaks only when lies drown the truth." Evelyn felt the eyes of 12 jurors pierce her soul. Ruth Miller trembled, her guilt cutting through her mask. Darren Cole whispered, "The air is split in two sides, faith and fear." Caleb Voss muttered, "I was only a weapon, not the hand that aimed me." Evelyn lifted her chin, whispering, "I am not their weapon, nor their wound." Judge Doyle's gavel echoed, but the tension refused to obey. Lightning cracked the horizon as Judge Doyle gestured for silence. Judge Doyle said, "The defense may close." Lena Cross stepped forward, her voice like tempered fire. Lena Cross said, "You have seen desperation dressed as evidence." Evelyn's heart surged, hearing hope flicker in her words. Miles Redding folded his arms, smirk hidden in shadow. Caleb Voss muttered, "I never saw her face in the deal." Ruth Miller gasped softly, her mask crumbling in the dim light. Darren Cole whispered into his mic, "The scales tip like a blade over glass." Evelyn whispered, "Let truth breathe, even when buried in smoke." The jury shifted, uneasy as thunder pounded their thoughts. The room held its breath, every heart tethered to the final words. Lena Cross said, "The truth may stagger, but it cannot be silenced." Evelyn felt her pulse align with the storm outside. Miles Redding said, "Guilt stands in her shadow." Judge Doyle lifted his gavel, eyes heavy with history. Darren Cole whispered, "This moment defines futures." Caleb Voss said, "I carried sin, not her hand." Ruth Miller closed her eyes, tears finally escaping. Evelyn whispered, "If this is my end, let it carve truth into stone." The gavel struck once, louder than thunder, a sound that sealed every soul in that room. The echo of the gavel lingered like a funeral bell, heavy and final. Evelyn's body felt hollow, but her eyes refused to dim. Evelyn said, "They will not erase me." Miles Redding said, "The jury will see betrayal before redemption." Lena Cross leaned close, her whisper steady as iron. Lena Cross said, "The storm outside is nothing compared to the storm we weather in here." Caleb Voss rubbed his wrists as if shackles had returned to haunt him. Darren Cole muttered into his recorder, "The resolution looms, but no heart is safe." Ruth Miller's gaze dropped, unable to meet Evelyn's eyes. Judge Doyle said, "We will reconvene for the jury's voice." The jury's footsteps echoed like war drums as they filed out, leaving silence that pressed against the chest. Evelyn whispered, "What if their silence condemns me?" Lena Cross said, "Truth has its own pulse. It will not stop beating." Miles Redding smirked faintly, confident in his narrative. Darren Cole said into his mic, "The weight of justice hangs like a noose." Caleb Voss muttered, "The wrong name cuts deeper than any blade." Ruth Miller's hands shook, her face pale beneath the flickering lights. Judge Doyle said, "The court is adjourned until the verdict is returned." The storm outside answered with lightning, as if the heavens cast their own vote. The gallery hummed with speculation, as reporters scribbled like frantic bees. Darren Cole said, "This will stain every headline tomorrow." Evelyn pressed her palms together, whispering, "If the truth costs me, let it cost me everything." Lena Cross placed a hand over Evelyn's, voice steady. Lena Cross said, "Stand tall, they can't kill resolve." Caleb Voss looked hollow, his confession gnawing at him like rot. Miles Redding adjusted his tie, savoring the moment like victory. Ruth Miller muttered under breath, "I cannot hold this secret." Judge Doyle slammed his gavel again, his voice low but resonant. Judge Doyle said, "Order, or I will empty this room." The storm outside eased to a drizzle, but tension thickened inside. Evelyn said, "Their choice will bind me forever." Lena Cross whispered, "Or free you." Miles Redding said, "Hope is the last mask of the guilty." Caleb Voss clenched his fists, regret dripping from his eyes. Darren Cole said into his recorder, "Every soul here is waiting to break." Ruth Miller's eyes darted, burden burning brighter. Judge Doyle folded his hands, the bench looming like a throne. Evelyn lifted her head, breathing deep, whispering, "Let them see who I am." The stillness hung, sharper than thunder had ever been. The doors opened with a creak, jurors returning like shadows carrying fate. Evelyn's pulse quickened, every step echoing inside her ribs. Ruth Miller looked down, avoiding Evelyn's eyes, as if guilt weighed her spine. Darren Cole whispered, "This is the end of breath before the fall." Miles Redding smoothed his suit, lips curling in anticipation. Lena Cross said, "Steady yourself. This moment belongs to truth." Caleb Voss shut his eyes, muttering, "Names cannot be unsaid." Judge Doyle's voice broke through the storm's hush. Judge Doyle said, "The jury has reached its verdict." Evelyn whispered, "So let it strike." The hush that settled was unlike any silence before, as if the air itself bowed beneath the weight of what was about to be spoken. Evelyn's body felt suspended, her pulse hammering louder than the storm's retreat. Judge Doyle said, "The jury will now deliver its verdict." The person stood, a figure of trembling authority, papers shaking in their hand. Miles Redding leaned in, hungry, every muscle taut with expectation. Lena Cross whispered, "Stand with breath, not fear." Evelyn's knees weakened, but her will anchored her upright. Darren Cole whispered into his recorder, "This is the second before history changes forever." Ruth Miller's hands clutched the wooden rail until her knuckles whitened. Caleb Voss whispered, "I set the fire that burns us all." Evelyn whispered, "Let it be the truth that binds me, not the lie." The foreperson's voice cracked against the silence. "On the charge of conspiracy to murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The words shattered the stillness like glass. Evelyn gasped, a breath caught between relief and disbelief. Miles Redding slammed his folder closed, the sharp sound cutting like a blade. Lena Cross closed her eyes, shoulders lowering as her victory found form. Ruth Miller broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as though chains had snapped. Darren Cole whispered, "The courtroom will split like thunder." Caleb Voss muttered, "I stained my soul, but she walks free." Judge Doyle nodded gravely, his voice steady. Judge Doyle said, "The defendant is discharged and free to leave this court." Evelyn whispered, "Free, but forever altered." The gallery erupted into chaos, voices rising in clashing waves of triumph and outrage. Some shouted blessings, others curses, and the storm's echo returned through human throats. Evelyn gripped the table, trembling as the noise battered her like waves. Miles Redding roared, "Justice has been mocked." His voice thundered, shaking the rafters. Lena Cross countered, her tone sharp as a sword. Lena Cross said, "Justice was upheld with proof, not vengeance." Darren Cole whispered into his recorder, "The room fractures. Truth and fury bleed together." Ruth Miller sobbed into her hands, guilt clawing free in a flood she could no longer hide. Caleb Voss said, "My confession bound her yet freed her." Judge Doyle's gavel cracked, but order refused to obey. Evelyn whispered, "Freedom tastes of ash." As noise faded into ragged silence, Evelyn rose, her legs unsteady but unbroken. Evelyn whispered, "I walk free, but shadows cling." Lena Cross touched her arm, whispering with steel and care. Lena Cross said, "Scars mark the truth but cannot erase it." Miles Redding turned, his face locked in rage, leaving the bench like a soldier retreating. Caleb Voss slumped, eyes hollow, whispering, "My sins cannot die." Ruth Miller stared at Evelyn, her eyes wet, guilt gnawing her from within. Darren Cole whispered into his mic, "The trial ends, but the scars linger." Judge Doyle lowered his gavel, his sigh carrying weight beyond the bench. Judge Doyle said, "This court is adjourned." Evelyn whispered, "Adjourned, but not absolved." The courtroom emptied slowly, the echoes of verdict and storm lingering like ghosts. Evelyn stood at the defense table, the weight of freedom pressing heavier than chains. She whispered, "Justice breathes, though scarred." Lena Cross stacked papers with calm precision, her eyes soft with quiet triumph. Miles Redding slammed the door on his exit, rage unresolved, echoing like a warning. Caleb Voss was led away in cuffs, silence draped around him like a shroud. Ruth Miller lingered, her body frozen by guilt she could not confess aloud. Darren Cole whispered into his recorder, "The trial has ended, but no soul leaves unscarred." Judge Doyle closed his ledger, his sigh fading into the silence of the storm's end. Evelyn whispered, "The truth remains, even in shadow."